For more than 30 years, Johnny Carson controlled the most powerful stage in American television. Night after night, he interviewed presidents, legends, and icons with flawless timing and carefully maintained emotional distance. But behind the calm delivery, the monologues, and the laughter timed to the second, Carson was always doing something else at the same time. He was studying human behavior. He noticed micro-expressions, shifts in posture, changes in breathing, and the subtle moments when a room seemed to change before the applause even began. For Carson, beauty was never just about appearance. It was about impact. It was about presence. It was about what happened to everyone else when a person walked onto the stage. In his later years, after retiring from television and stepping away from the nightly performance of control, Carson privately reflected on the guests who had truly affected him. Not the most famous, not the most glamorous, but the rare few who made him lose his rhythm, forget the next question on his card, or witness the studio fall into an unnatural silence. These moments were unusual precisely because Carson was known for never losing control. This was not a list he shared publicly, and it was never meant to be a ranking. It was a quiet confession from a man at the end of a long career, looking back and asking a different question than the world had asked him for decades. Not who was the most beautiful, but who was impossible to ignore. Because if beauty were only about a face, Johnny Carson would have remembered many more. The women we explore tonight did more than turn heads. Their presence altered behavior, shifted power, and briefly exposed something deeply human in a man whose entire career was built on never revealing too much of himself. So the real question is this: what kind of beauty can make even the most controlled man on television lose control if only for a moment? Raquel Welch. The woman who made everyone in the room hold their breath. When Raquel Welch walked onto the Tonight Show stage in 1970, the reaction wasn't just applause, it was a collective intake of breath. A veteran camera operator remembered it as something almost physical, the room tightening, the air changing, the audience reacting before the interview even began. He worked camera 2 on guest entrances, and the director would whisper in his headset right before she appeared, "Take your time on this one. No one's going to complain." In a studio built on rhythm and control, Welch changed the tempo on arrival. Johnny Carson noticed it too. Carson was famous for staying cool with everyone, from politicians to movie royalty, but Welch made him briefly slip. He hesitated, glanced down at his blue card, then looked back up like he had to restart his own train of thought. The moment mattered because it was rare. Welch wasn't the kind of beauty that asked permission. She didn't dilute her presence with self-deprecating jokes or an act of modesty. She moved with an unapologetic awareness of effect timing, posture, gestures. Even the way she crossed and uncrossed her legs felt deliberate. Off camera, a producer recalled Carson saying, "She doesn't enter a room, she takes it over," and he meant it as real praise. Behind the scenes, her appearances created what staff jokingly called the Raquel effect. Men from departments that had nothing to do with production suddenly found reasons to be on set. Engineers discovered urgent equipment issues that somehow required them near the stage. Even NBC executives, who rarely attended tapings, materialized in the wings. Carson noticed the crowding and quipped during a commercial break, "If she signed up for the Army, there'd be no draft dodgers." The joke landed because everyone could see it happening. But Welch didn't become unforgettable simply because she was stunning. A Tonight Show writer pointed out that most beautiful guests leaned on looks alone. Welch brought something extra: sharp wit, strong stories, and a subtle flirtation that created real chemistry without turning the interview into a shallow spectacle. There was one night, a producer remembered, when she wore a red dress with a neckline that defied physics. Carson started a question, lost his place mid-sentence, checked his card, and laughed. "I'm sorry, what was I saying?" The audience roared because Johnny almost never got flustered, and the honesty made him human. What Carson admired most, though, was her self-knowledge. He engaged her seriously, asking about choices, control, and how she navigated an industry determined to reduce her to beauty. While rarely acknowledging her as one of Hollywood's early Latina leading ladies, Welch didn't just make Carson look, she made him adjust. When Sophia Loren made her first Tonight Show appearance in 1979, Studio One didn't just welcome a guest, the room transformed. Her entrance was confident, unhurried, and regal, and a crew member later called it a masterclass in sensuality without saying a word. Unlike the barely controlled chaos that followed some beautiful guests, Loren inspired something closer to reverence. Voices lowered, backstage joking stopped, and everyone seemed determined to be on their absolute best behavior. Johnny Carson was visibly flustered, and the people who knew him best saw it in the small tells. He leaned forward more than usual, laughed a little too enthusiastically, and kept touching his tie signals that the master of television cool was genuinely affected. Loren didn't project the approachable cheerfulness of many American beauties. She carried European gravitas and sensual maturity that caught Carson slightly off guard, and her Italian accent could make even a simple remark sound like poetry. A Tonight Show writer summed it up: "You don't interview Sophia Loren. You try to survive her." She brought intensity to the conversation. Her eyes would lock onto Carson's when she spoke, and you could almost see him fighting to keep his professional rhythm. During one story, she placed her hand on his arm to emphasize a point, and a director later joked they might need to cut to commercial just to give Johnny time to regain his composure. What made Loren so compelling was the contrast between the smoldering screen persona and the thoughtful, sometimes philosophical woman on the couch. Viewers expected a sex symbol. Instead, they heard insights about Italian neo-realist cinema, the difficulty of maintaining authenticity in Hollywood, and the experience of growing up in war-torn Italy. Carson responded to that substance. Rather than reducing her to glamour, he engaged her as an artist, asking thoughtful questions about her work with directors like Vittorio De Sica and Federico Fellini, and about how she protected her identity inside the American system. Behind the scenes, the staff treated her like visiting royalty, not only because of how she looked, but because of what she represented, an international film legend with cultural weight. With Loren, Carson held a rare balance, dazzled by her beauty, yet anchored by intellectual respect, and that tension is why her appearances didn't just look beautiful. They felt electric. To everyone watching, it was proof that presence can overpower polish, even on Carson's perfectly calibrated stage. When Bo Derek walked onto The Tonight Show in late 1979, shortly after 10 turned her into America's newest fantasy, something unprecedented happened in Studio One. The audience fell into complete silence. This wasn't the normal swell of applause that greeted celebrities. It was a collective moment of stunned appreciation so strong that Johnny Carson had to wait longer than usual before he could even start the interview. A talent coordinator from that period said that even the staff people who lived around famous faces weren't prepared for her in person. "There's something different about beauty in 3 dimensions," he explained. And in Derek's case, the camera actually diminished her rather than enhancing her, which almost never happened. Carson was a host built on timing, rhythm, and control, yet Derek disrupted all 3. A producer remembered Carson calling her a living statue, and later admitting she was one of the few guests who made him forget his next question. Not because she said anything shocking, but because of the strange disconnect between how extraordinary she looked and how ordinary in the best sense she seemed as a person. Unlike overnight sensations who arrived with rehearsed anecdotes and practiced charm, Derek came across disarmingly natural. She didn't seem to be performing fame. She answered questions plainly, without calculation, as if the massive reaction around her belonged to someone else. That effect didn't stop at Carson. It spread across the room like a spell. Cameramen stayed fixed on her even during moments when they were supposed to be capturing Carson's reactions. NBC pages found reasons to linger near the stage. Even Doc Severinsen and the band people who had seen countless beautiful women come and go went unusually quiet while she spoke. A camera operator joked you could literally hear the air conditioning because the audience didn't blink. Carson noticed too. During a commercial break, he turned to Ed McMahon and said, "I could read the phone book right now, and they'd think it was fascinating." Ed fired back, "They haven't taken their eyes off her long enough to notice you're still here." Backstage, Derek was notable for what she didn't demand. At a time when many stars arrived with lighting requirements, specific angles, and lists of approved topics, she showed up with no entourage and no special requests. After her first appearance, Carson told a producer she has no idea how beautiful she is, and that makes her twice as beautiful. Later, he contrasted her with guests who had learned how to be famous, building a public character to match their looks. With Bo Derek, fame had happened too suddenly for that, and Carson found that unguarded authenticity almost rarer than beauty itself. Elizabeth Taylor's appearance on The Tonight Show was treated as an event before it ever aired. NBC executives, who rarely interfered with Johnny Carson's program, attended pre-production meetings to discuss how her segment should be handled. Taylor almost never did television interviews, and her 1,992 appearance carried the weight of an ending. To many inside the studio, she was not just a star, but the last of a disappearing kind, a direct link to Hollywood's golden age. From the moment she arrived, the atmosphere shifted. Crew members who had worked with presidents, music legends, and cultural icons suddenly stood straighter and spoke more quietly. A stage manager later said, "It felt like genuine royalty had entered the building." Unlike most guests, Taylor was not casually escorted to the green room. The head producer greeted her personally, and Carson himself, who almost never met guests before taping, broke routine to welcome her in advance. Her entrance confirmed everything. Where most celebrities walked onto the stage seeking approval, Taylor arrived as if she were granting it. She acknowledged the standing ovation with a measured nod and a composed smile that was both gracious and authoritative. A cameraman summed it up perfectly. Other guests walk in. She arrived. In that moment, the center of gravity shifted, and everyone in the room felt it. The interview revealed how rare that shift was. Carson, usually the unquestioned focal point of every conversation, subtly adjusted his approach. He did not push or dominate. He made space. The lighting was softened to emphasize Taylor's legendary violet eyes. The camera blocking included more close-ups than usual, and the control room carried a specific note: tighter shots, fewer interruptions. This was not indulgence. It was preservation. Taylor spoke with restraint and precision, never oversharing, never performing vulnerability. Carson admired that discipline. He asked substantive questions about her long career, her humanitarian work, and how Hollywood had changed since she began as a child actress. She answered thoughtfully, maintaining the mystique that had defined her stardom. After the show, Carson remarked that true stars do not give everything away, they protect something. In an era increasingly shaped by confessional celebrity, Elizabeth Taylor represented something nearly extinct: grandeur without apology, beauty anchored by self-knowledge, and fame carried like a crown rather than a request. For Carson, she was not simply one of the most beautiful women to ever appear on his show. She was the last Hollywood goddess, and he treated her as such. When Farrah Fawcett appeared on The Tonight Show in 1976, the reaction inside Studio One crossed into something unprecedented. The applause didn't fade. It swelled. Audience members stood, leaned into the aisles, and ignored instructions to remain seated, desperate for a closer look. The ovation went on so long that Carson had to signal the control room to trim it for broadcast. One NBC page later said, "It felt less like a television taping and more like the Beatles arriving at Shea Stadium." Fawcett's fame had exploded almost overnight. Her red swimsuit poster sold more than 12 million copies, Charlie's Angels had just premiered, and her image seemed unavoidable. Yet what struck Carson most wasn't the scale of her popularity, it was the feeling she brought with her. Where other beautiful guests created silence or awe, Farrah created happiness. A talent coordinator described it perfectly. She was like human champagne. The room felt lighter simply because she was in it. That energy disrupted Carson's rhythm in a way few guests ever had. Farrah leaned forward when she spoke, laughed easily, and answered questions without calculation. Carson later joked that if she appeared every week, he would forget how to talk. During one break, Ed McMahon leaned over and deadpanned, "They haven't taken their eyes off her long enough to notice you're still here." Even Doc Severinsen and the band, usually chatting between segments, fell silent, watching her instead of their charts. Behind the scenes, her bookings created a special anticipation. Staff members showed up in nicer clothes. Extra people found reasons to be near the stage. Even Carson, normally consistent to the point of ritual, seemed to take extra care on days Farrah was scheduled. Yet despite her cultural dominance, she arrived with no entourage, no lighting demands, and no pre-approved talking points. She followed the conversation wherever Carson led it. One unscripted moment became legendary. When Carson joked about her famous hair, Farrah challenged him to try styling it himself. She handed him a brush on live television. The audience exploded. Carson stood up, visibly terrified of ruining those iconic waves, and the moment turned into pure, spontaneous comedy, effortless because it was real. Afterward, Carson remarked that Farrah was beautiful in a way connected to good health rather than careful construction. She wasn't performing beauty. She embodied it, paired with an openness that filled the room. For Carson, Farrah Fawcett represented a rare combination: extraordinary beauty without armor, fame without distance, and a presence that didn't demand attention yet received it completely. When Diahann Carroll walked onto the Tonight Show stage, the room did not erupt, it settled. There was no stunned silence, no frenzy, no visible disruption of control. Instead, a quiet attention took hold, the kind reserved for someone whose presence carried meaning beyond appearance. Carroll was beautiful, yes, but her beauty arrived with gravity. By the time she sat across from Johnny Carson, she was already a pioneer. As the first black woman to star in her own network television series in a non-stereotypical role with Julia in 1968, Carroll represented a cultural shift that could not be separated from her elegance. Carson understood that distinction immediately. Where he teased and flirted with other beautiful guests, his tone with Carroll was measured, respectful, and deliberate. What struck the staff most was her composure. Many guests showed nerves when the red light came on. Carroll never did. She spoke calmly, articulately, and with a confidence that suggested she was fully aware of both her position and her responsibility. A talent coordinator once remarked that Carroll seemed to float onto the set poised, centered, and entirely unshaken. Her interviews stood out because of their balance. Carroll could move seamlessly from light conversation to serious subjects without changing her demeanor. She spoke about fashion, career choices, and Hollywood etiquette, then pivoted to the realities of being a black woman navigating an industry that had long excluded performers who looked like her. When Carson asked about a recent role during one appearance, Carroll gently redirected the conversation toward the limited opportunities still available to black actresses. She did so without confrontation, without raising her voice, and without breaking the rhythm of the show. Carson followed her lead. Behind the scenes, her appearances inspired a different kind of respect. There was no scrambling for a closer look, no backstage chaos. Instead, there was discipline. Pages, producers, and crew members treated her with an attentiveness usually reserved for figures of institutional importance. A stage manager later described it simply: beauty with authority behind it. Carson admired that authority. He once told a producer that Carroll had a rare gift, the ability to say something important without making anyone feel lectured. She did not demand attention, she commanded it through clarity and restraint. Her style reflected the same philosophy. While younger actresses chased trends, Carroll arrived in impeccably tailored, timeless outfits that projected self-respect and permanence. For Carson, Diahann Carroll represented a form of beauty that carried consequence. She was glamorous without being ornamental, serious without being severe, and historically significant without ever announcing it. On a stage built to entertain, she reminded everyone watching that presence, when paired with purpose, could quietly change the room. When Ursula Andress first appeared on The Tonight Show in the 1960s, the reaction inside Studio One was immediate and unmistakable. This was not excitement or applause alone. It was awe. The woman who had emerged from the sea in Dr. No, wearing a white bikini, an image that permanently altered the language of cinematic glamour, walked onto Carson's stage, carrying the weight of a cultural moment everyone already understood. Carson felt it instantly. During her introduction, he briefly lost his place, stopping mid-sentence before recovering with a small smile. For the most prepared host in television, that pause spoke volumes. A cameraman later recalled that it was one of the rare moments when Carson seemed momentarily hypnotized rather than in control. Andress did not perform for the room. She occupied it. What set her apart from American sex symbols was her European directness. Where many actresses deflected compliments with humor or modesty, Andress accepted admiration calmly, without apology or exaggeration. She answered questions plainly, sometimes with a blunt honesty that startled Carson and delighted the audience. A writer once observed that she wasn't trying to be charming, she simply was, without effort. Behind the scenes, her appearances created a focused stillness. There was little joking, little movement, and almost no backstage chatter. Crew members described a reverent atmosphere, not because Andress demanded it, but because everyone sensed they were in the presence of someone who had created a permanent imprint on film history. She wasn't just beautiful, she was iconic. Carson handled her with a balance he rarely achieved so cleanly. He acknowledged her extraordinary beauty, but he did not reduce her to it. Instead, he asked about how Dr. No had changed her life, how the Bond franchise evolved after her debut, and how she viewed her own place within that legacy. Andress answered without false modesty. When asked about the famous beach scene, she reportedly said that one does not create a moment like that and expect life to remain the same. It was factual, honest, and refreshingly unperformed. What Carson admired most was her self-containment. Andress did not seek approval from American audiences or television culture. She carried herself with a European certainty that did not require reassurance. In private conversations, Carson contrasted her with guests who arrived desperate to be liked. Ursula Andress knew who she was, knew what she had created, and allowed the world to respond as it wished. For Carson, Andress represented a rare ideal. Beauty without apology, confidence without arrogance, and presence without calculation. She was not performing glamour, she was the source of it, and on Carson's carefully calibrated stage, that kind of certainty was impossible to ignore. Perhaps the most intriguing name connected to Johnny Carson's list of the most beautiful women was the one who never actually sat on his couch. Marilyn Monroe died in 1962, just months before Carson became the permanent host of The Tonight Show. Yet throughout his 30-year tenure, her presence lingered like a ghost over the program. Carson would occasionally reference her in interviews, not as a punchline, but as a benchmark, the standard against which Hollywood glamour was quietly measured. To Carson, Monroe represented the ultimate missed opportunity. In private conversations, he often wondered how an interview with her might have unfolded. He believed that beneath the carefully manufactured sex symbol was a complicated, intelligent woman whose vulnerability and ambition would have made her a uniquely compelling guest. It was exactly the kind of contradiction Carson loved exploring, the tension between public image and private reality. Early in his career, Carson's comments about Monroe tended to reflect how the culture saw her at the time as the definitive blonde bombshell. But as the decades passed and more was revealed about Monroe's inner life, Carson's perspective evolved. By the 1980s and 1990s, his references to her carried a deeper sense of regret and empathy. He began speaking about her not just as a beauty icon, but as someone shaped and damaged by the machinery of fame. A longtime producer recalled that Monroe became a recurring point of comparison. When Carson interviewed a new generation of glamorous actresses, he would occasionally mention her as the unreachable ideal, not because no one could match her looks, but because no one else seemed to embody the same fragile intersection of allure, sadness, and longing. Monroe, in Carson's mind, haunted the show without ever appearing on it. This shift in understanding was especially evident when Carson spoke with actresses who portrayed Monroe on screen or were frequently compared to her. Rather than focusing on physical resemblance or surface glamour, Carson asked about Monroe's psychology, her insecurity, her intelligence, and the emotional cost of being reduced to an image. During one off-camera conversation with a film historian, Carson listened intently as Monroe's intellectual curiosity was discussed. Her love of literature, her poetry, her attempts to train seriously as an actress. Afterward, Carson quietly remarked, "We all missed who she really was." For a man who spent his life trying to see past performance and persona, Monroe represented the ultimate paradox. She was perhaps the most famous image in American culture, yet one of the least understood individuals behind it. Carson believed that, had she lived, she would have been not just visually captivating, but profoundly interesting, someone whose contradictions would have brought out his best work as an interviewer. In the end, Marilyn Monroe remained the most beautiful woman never to appear on The Tonight Show. Not because she was absent, but because her absence said everything about how fame can consume the very person it elevates. Johnny Carson interviewed thousands of women across 3 decades, yet only a few left a lasting imprint on how he understood beauty. Looking back at the 8 women who stood out and the one who never appeared, it becomes clear that Carson was never ranking faces. He was observing something far more elusive. Raquel Welch commanded a room with certainty, fully aware of her power and unafraid to use it. Sophia Loren altered the temperature of a studio simply by arriving, carrying history and intellect alongside beauty. Bo Derek disarmed everyone by seeming untouched by her own myth. Elizabeth Taylor shifted gravity itself, reminding Carson what true Hollywood royalty looked like. Farrah Fawcett filled the room with joy rather than silence, proving that beauty could feel like warmth. Diane Carroll brought elegance sharpened by responsibility, making beauty inseparable from meaning. Ursula Andress embodied confidence without apology, refusing to perform for approval. And Marilyn Monroe, absent but omnipresent, represented the ultimate paradox, an image so powerful it erased the person behind it. What united these women was not symmetry or sex appeal. It was presence. Carson was drawn to women who understood who they were, whether instinctively or through hard-earned self-knowledge. Some controlled the room, some softened it. Some challenged him intellectually, others unsettled him emotionally. But all of them disrupted his rhythm in ways that could not be rehearsed. Carson spent his life studying people. He noticed posture, timing, restraint, and authenticity. Beauty, to him, was never passive. It was active, something that revealed character under pressure. That is why these appearances lingered in his memory long after countless others faded. They were moments when television stopped being performance and became something closer to truth. In the end, Johnny Carson's list tells us less about who was beautiful and more about what beauty meant to him. It was not youth or perfection. It was authority without arrogance, confidence without apology, mystery without pretense. And sometimes, as in the case of Marilyn Monroe, it was the quiet ache of knowing that the most fascinating stories are not always the ones we get to hear.